Pastor Shay here, and I'm here to read another chapter of Pansy and the Promise. Now, if you have not gone to the parent resource, you need to. There's amazing coloring sheets. There's some awesome Bible study resources, a whole bunch of stuff. So make sure you go check out pansyandthepromise.com and get a bunch of free stuff to help parents and to have fun with your kids as we read this together. So we're going to dive into chapter 13 tonight. Ready? Pansy and the Promise, chapter 13, Tucker Island. It took almost an hour to go 6 miles along the beach, which brought them to the campground. As Papa guided the horse into the campground, they rode under a huge sign, which read, "The Island Campground where strangers and travelers are welcome." Papa led his team of horses to the camp office where people went to pay the owner for their stay. While Papa was gone, Pansy began to spy out the neighborhood from her perch on the pillows, looking out the back of the wagon. The camp was filled with tents of every size and shape. There were also a few covered wagons, a lot like theirs, but none of them had bed hooks on the sides or chickens hanging underneath. Pansy laughed every time she thought of how silly they must look going down the road. Pansy climbed out of the wagon and whistled to Star. "Let's go, boy," she shouted, and Star quickly took his place next to Pansy. Pansy asked Mama if she could walk over to a little park right in the center of the campground. It was only a short stroll from the camp office, so Mama gave her permission to go to the park. Pansy was hoping to find other children, but the park was completely empty. Later, they would learn that most of the people living at the campground were workers who had jobs in the Galveston shipyards and warehouses along the docks. Many of them were single men without families. This is why Pansy and Star found the park empty. There were swings and other playground equipment. Pansy saw the tallest slipper slide she had ever seen, but no children were playing in the area. Not a single one. Pansy thought to herself how lonely swings look when there's no children to sit on them. The ocean breeze moved them back and forth lightly, almost as though invisible children were sitting on them and swinging slightly. Pansy walked up to the swing and was about to sit on it when she heard a voice behind her call out, "You want a teeter-totter?" Pansy's head swung around so fast her ponytail slapped her in the face. The voice repeated the invitation again. "You want a teeter-totter?" This time she saw a boy about her age climbing down, or rather dropping, almost falling down out of a large oak tree. As he bounded down from his perch on a lower limb, his feet made a little cloud of dust that puffed over his shoes. Pansy was startled at first, since she thought she was alone in the park. "Who are you?" the boy asked, having not received an answer to his first question. "I'm Pansy Hunt," she said to the stranger who appeared from the trees. "Oh, well, I'm Joseph, but everyone calls me Little Joe," he said. "Why do they call you Little Joe?" quizzed Pansy. "Because my dad's name's Joe, so do you want a teeter-totter or not?" Pansy now glanced over the big slide to a contraption that had been built out of wood. It was a long board that rested on a steel bar. One child could sit on one end of the board, the other could sit on the other end of the board, and make each other go up and down. By now, Little Joe was already on his end, so Pansy climbed aboard the other end, and they began to go up and down as they teeter-tottered. The conversation went something like this. "Joe, you just getting here?" Pansy, "Yep." "Joe, where are you from?" Pansy, "New Mexico." "Joe, where's that?" Pansy, 1,000 miles away." "Joe, is that your wagon over there?" Pansy, "Yep." "Joe, it looks funny." Pansy, "I know." "Joe, why do you have chickens underneath it?" Pansy, "To get eggs." Joe, "Oh." Long silence. "Joe, you like frogs?" Pansy, "Well, I guess sometimes." Joe, "You want to go catch some?" Pansy, "Maybe." Joe, "Just before the sun sets, there are hundreds of them in the swamp behind the camp." Pansy, Joe, "My wagon is the last one on the back row next to the well." Pansy, "Is that right?" Joe, "Come after dinner and I'll show you how to catch them." Pansy, "Not sure I can." Joe, "Hey, I gotta go now. Bye." Pansy, "But..." With that, Little Joe jumped off the teeter-totter while Pansy was in mid-air, which sent her crashing to the ground. Pansy's feet caught the dirt just before the crash, softening her blow as her end of the teeter-totter hit the ground. Holding on, she looked up at the board, now empty seat on the other end. In the distance, Little Joe was running toward his wagon. As she crawled off the teeter-totter and headed back to the wagon, she said to Star, "That has got to be the strangest boy I've ever met in my life." By that time, Pansy and Star arrived back at the wagon. Papa had finished his business and was climbing up to the seat, ready to get a campsite for the night. Papa tended to the horses and campfire, while Mama and Pansy fixed dinner. Tonight would be fried chicken and fresh vegetables. Mama told Pansy to go under the wagon, pick out a chicken, and bring it to her. Pansy knew just what to do. She had done this before on the ranch. The selected chicken would become tonight's dinner. "Sorry, girl," she said, as she plucked a cackling hen from out from the cage. Holding the squawking bird, she handed it to Mama. Pansy didn't like the next part. Mama laid the bird down, and with one swift swoosh, it was over. Mama washed off the bird, dipped it in the pot of hot boiling water, then handed it to Pansy for plucking. It was Pansy's job to pluck out the feathers until all that was left was a pinkish, naked, headless bird. Surprisingly, this job was not so unpleasant to Pansy. "Ready?" Pansy called out to Mama. Pansy watched carefully as Mama prepared the meal. From time to time, she would help with the mixing and stirring. Little by little, she was learning to be a wonderful cook like her Mama. As they set the table with dishes and silverware for the meal, Pansy told Mama about the strange boy she had met in the park, how he had liked to go hunting for frogs. "Frogs?" exclaimed Mama. "Don't bring any of those slimy things around here." When Papa heard about frogs, he laughed and told the girls frog legs are good eating. "They may be good for you, George Hunt," cried Mama, "but not for me." For some reason, though, Pansy didn't tell Papa or Mama that Little Joe had asked her to go frogging with him. After dinner, Papa sat back in his chair and let out a big sigh. "Mama," he said, "what a wonderful dinner." Papa looked at Pansy with a twinkle in his eye and said, "That's one less chicken returning to the ranch." Then he gave out a laugh. Pansy had watched all afternoon for other children to appear from the neighboring wagons, and she saw no one, except for an occasional adult, coming and going. Most of the time it was men who looked like salesmen or dock workers. Before sunset, Pansy wandered again to the park. This time she looked up into the trees with hope of seeing another child. There were none at all. For a while she sat with one of the swings and swayed back and forth. From her swing she could look across the road and see the sand dunes. Just beyond the dunes, the sparkling ocean water. When a large wave would reach the shore, she would hear a crash of water on the beach. Most of the time, though, she felt the constant, unending ocean breeze. There was something soothing and sleepy about the ocean breeze. Pansy closed her eyes and imagined she was one of the big sailing ships they had seen as they were traveling along the shore. She rocked her swing from side to side and pretended she was navigating the ocean waves. "Are you ready to go?" sounded the familiar voice behind her. "Huh?" Pansy turned around. "This made the second time today this boy has startled me," thought Pansy. "Go where?" Pansy snapped back. Little Joe's voice never changed. It was always a monotone, matter-of-fact sound, never too excited, never much expression. It was sort of a flat, plain voice that answered, "Froggin', it's time to go froggin'." Pansy hadn't noticed the long stick in Little Joe's hands. At the end of the stick was a sharp nail which stuck out of the wood. "Here," said Little Joe, "take my pole. I've got another one in my wagon." Almost without thinking, Pansy found the pole in her hand and felt her legs following Little Joe toward the wagon. Maybe it was the boredom of no other children, or maybe it was her love of the adventure. Maybe it was a little bit of both. But in a couple of minutes, they were walking together through the tall marsh weeds that stretched for miles behind the campground. "We're looking for big ones today," said Little Joe. Pansy was wondering why she had left Star tied up in the wagon. The sun was getting low in the sky, and Pansy knew she would be expected back before long. As they pushed ahead, the grass began to get taller and taller, thicker and thicker, until it was as tall or taller than either she or Little Joe. Little Joe didn't seem to be bothered by any of this, but just kept pushing ahead, never saying a single word. Pansy could see that Little Joe was following a trail of some kind. "Have you been here before?" she asked. "Of course," was the short, hollow, flat reply. Then, as though some colorful light went on in Little Joe's head, he spoke for the first time with excitement. "In just a minute, you're going to see something beautiful." It was the most expression she had ever heard in his voice. Part of Pansy wanted to turn around and rush back to the wagon, but another part of her wanted to see what the strange boy thought was so special. On they pushed just a little more, when, all at once, they popped out of the tall brush which opened to the bay side of the island. It was calm as a lake and blue as the sky. "See, I told you it was beautiful," Little Joe proclaimed proudly. Pansy had to admit it was a lovely sight, especially with the sun setting in the background, creating colorful rays of light on the water. "Let's go," said Little Joe, interrupting her thinking. "Go where?" questioned Pansy. Then she saw what Little Joe was talking about. On the shore was a boat, if you could call it a boat. It was small, old, probably abandoned. It had once been painted white with green trim, but now all the paint was peeling, and it looked in terrible shape. Again, the command came from Little Joe. "Let's go, hop in." By now, Little Joe had grabbed the stern of the vessel and was ready to launch into the sea. "That doesn't look safe," said Pansy. "Besides, where are you intending to go?" "To my island," said Little Joe. "Your island?" Pansy almost laughed. "Don't laugh. I've been there lots of times. We can be there in 10 minutes. It's where all the big frogs live." Pansy looked at the boat and looked out at the water. "We'll be back before the sun sets," Little Joe offered his promise. Before she thought about it, Pansy was in the boat, and the two of them were paddling toward what looked like a sand dune in the middle of the bay. In fact, it was a place where sand had built up into a little island in the middle of the bay with grass and a few trees. The bay was only about 2 miles across. The island, or Tucker Island, as Little Joe called it, since his last name was Tucker, was only a mile or so from the shore. As they paddled, Pansy noticed the water getting deeper and deeper. "Come on, paddle," said Little Joe to his shipmate. Here's a picture. Pansy began to stroke the water. As the land began to slip away behind them, Pansy had that sort of uneasy feeling you get when you know that you might be doing something that's not the best idea. Being adventurous, though, she shook it off and began to paddle vigorously away from the shore and toward a little hump of sand that stuck up out of the water a long way ahead of them. As she paddled, Pansy was taking in the sights and sounds of the Galveston Bay. Seagulls were soaring overhead, and occasional fish could be jumping out of the water, making splash circles reaching in all directions. The breeze on the side of the island was not as strong, but still enough to whistle through her hair. It wasn't long until the shore in the front of them was closer than the one they had left. Pansy could see little scrubby trees and green grass here and there growing out of the sand, although it was more like weeds than grass. It was easy to see that it was an empty island with no living person on it. It was precisely at this moment that something horrible began to happen. About 15 minutes into their trip, the bottom of the little boat began to fill with water. Pansy saw the water first, and with alarm her voice told Little Joe. The two of them paddled faster and faster, trying to reach the island shore before the boat filled with water. At first, the water just covered the floor of the boat, but pretty soon it had risen to their ankles. "Paddle faster," said Little Joe. The island was about 100 yards away, but by now the boat was filling faster than they could paddle. The weight of the water in the boat made it impossible to make progress. The boat was sinking fast, only a few yards away from the shore. They had to abandon ship. Out of the boat, they both jumped and began to swim to shore. They made it just in time to look back and see the last little point of the wooden watercraft slip under the waves.